Screen is black. The only sound is the chilling, metallic ripping of an MG42 for a full 5 seconds. It then cuts to silence. This sound was the soundtrack to a world war. A sound so terrifying it earned a name, Hitler's buzzsaw. For the soldiers who heard it, it was the last sound they would ever hear. This is the story of the machine gun that changed everything. Quick, stark text on screen. The MG42, military voice. The unforgettable scream of the MG42. The frozen fields near Kursk were a landscape of the dead. Morning mist clung to the shattered skeletons of trees, and the earth trembled not from nature, but from the distant growl of panzer engines. But through that low rumble cut a different sound, a sound that turned veterans' blood to ice. It was a harsh, frantic, metallic scream, like a giant tearing the sky in two. Allied soldiers had a name for it, a name born of pure dread. Hitler. For the man of a British platoon moving cautiously through a wheat field, the sound was an abstract terror, until it wasn't. It wasn't the methodical thump, thump, thump of familiar machine guns. This was a continuous ripping roar, a solid wall of noise that seemed to physically hammer them into the ground. At a rate of 1,200 rounds per minute, the MG42 fired faster than the ear could process. In the time it took a man to blink, 20 rounds could saturate his position. There was no rhythm to anticipate, no lull to exploit, just the endless, screaming sweep of certain death. Crouched in a camouflage nest, Obergefreiter Hans Müller was the source of that storm. His world had shrunk to the length of his weapon. Steam rose from the MG42's perforated barrel jacket, the metal glowing with a dull heat. His hands, caked in grime and oil, worked the charging handle with unconscious precision. To his right, his loader, young Kurt Weiss, fed a fresh 250-round belt into the feed tray. Their movements were a choreographed dance of destruction, perfected under fire. The MG42 was not just a weapon to them. It was a demanding partner, a living entity that required constant, reverent care. The first burst from Mueller's gun tore the morning apart. It didn't sound like gunfire. It was the air itself being shredded. Dirt and snow erupted in fountains. Men who a moment before were advancing with rifles at the ready were now broken, motionless shapes in the mud. A British corporal, his heart trying to beat its way out of his chest, scrambled behind the husk of a burnt-out truck. Tracer rounds, brilliant and lethal, stitched the ground around him, their crack thump lost in the overarching roar. He didn't scream. He simply mouthed a silent, desperate question to no one. What is that?
That sound became the universal language of fear on the World War II battlefield. It was a sound that carried for miles, a psychological weapon as potent as its physical one. Allied intelligence reports referred to it with a mixture of horror and professional admiration. Soldiers learned to identify an MG42's presence not by seeing its muzzle flash, but by hearing that unmistakable, demonic ripping noise, a sound that could paralyze an entire platoon with sheer auditory terror. The genius behind the terror was one of brutal efficiency. The MG42 was born from the brutal lessons of the Eastern Front. The German Army's previous machine gun, the refined MG34, was a masterpiece of precision engineering, but it was slow to build and prone to jamming in the mud and snow. The Wehrmacht demanded a new gun, something cheaper, faster to produce, and utterly reliable. The answer was a revolution in weapon design. Engineer Werner Gruner looked not to a gunsmith's bench, but to a factory stamping press. The MG42 was made largely from stamped and pressed steel components, spot-welded and riveted together. This radical approach slashed production time and cost, allowing German factories to churn out these devastating weapons by the hundreds of thousands. It was a machine gun for the industrial age. Its key features were legendary. The quick-change barrel system allowed a trained crew like Mueller and Kurt to swap a red-hot barrel for a cool one in under 5 seconds, maintaining a rate of fire that would destroy any other gun. And that incredible rate of fire, over 20 rounds per second, was its defining characteristic. It created a beaten zone so saturated with bullets that crossing it was a statistical impossibility. It was designed to suppress, to dominate, and to terrify. In the heat of the Kursk battle, Mueller's position became a vortex of fire and motion. The barrel of his MG42 was now a dull, angry red. "Barrel change!" Kurt screamed over the deafening cacophony of the gun and incoming Soviet artillery. In a single fluid motion, Mueller hit the release, gripped the handle, and slid the smoking barrel out. Kurt slapped a fresh one into place. The action took less than 4 seconds. The silence lasted for a single heartbeat before the buzzsaw screamed back to life, continuing its deadly work without missing a beat. By nightfall, the field was silent, save for the moaning wind and the crackle of distant fires. The acrid smell of cordite and scorched metal hung heavy in the air. Mueller wiped a weary hand across his face, smearing soot and sweat. He looked at the mountain of spent brass casings that glittered around their nest in the moonlight. Each one represented a moment of controlled violence, a life potentially ended. Kurt sat quietly, staring at the now silent weapon. "Do you ever think about what this thing really is?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Mueller didn't answer immediately. He just stared at the dark field. They both knew the answer. The MG42 was more than steel and wood. It was the sound of their war, a sound of overwhelming power and profound fear. It was the sound of Hitler's buzzsaw, a mechanical scream that echoes through history.